My pleasure to welcome you all for this day 5 of this COVID Pulse Packed Pediatric Acute Care Training Lecture Series 2 of the PICCMC Vellore Initiative. And thank you, and I welcome you all for joining this sessions. Hope it's been useful, and so far we have been doing this series, starting with the introduction to COVID preparedness, overall about the pediatric case management, MSC, identifying sick child, and oxygen therapy and the devices. Today we are going to have pediatric airway management, which is a very important and essential topic because it's which is quite different from adults, and it involves a lot of anatomical as well as physiological considerations. And Dr. Jolly will be doing this. And before giving the to start before starting this session, I request the moderators. I would be happy to introduce today's moderators, Dr. Tanuj Kumar Verma, uh, consultant pediatric intensivist at Pediatric ICU at Bridgelal Super Specialty Hospital and Research Institute, Haldwani, Uttarakhand. And he's nothing, he's not a stranger to us, he's one among us. He did his fellowship with us in pediatric critical care. After his MD Pediatrics, he did the IDP CCM of the Indian IAP College of Pediatric Critical Care and the postdoctoral fellowship in intensive care at CMC Vellore. And he's been working in Haldwani, Uttarakhand. Dr. Tanuj, I'm happy to welcome you for this. I'm really thank you for agreeing to be the moderator. And we have another moderator, Dr. Sudhasata Ghosh. She will be joining soon. She's a clinical fellow at Cardiac Intensive Care Unit at Royal Brompton Hospital, Guy's and St. Thomas NHS Foundation Trust in the United Kingdom. And she's after a DNB Pediatrics, she did a IDP CCM, that's the fellowship of the College of Pediatric Critical Care and postdoctoral fellowship in Pediatric Intensive Care at CMC Vellore. She's also one of our alumni, and I'm happy to welcome. And when she joins back, we'll introduce again. Over to you, Tanuj.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you
I-
so much for such a kind word, sir. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome today for the series 2 of PACT, Pediatric Acute Care Training. So I would like to welcome everyone to my respected teachers, faculty, delegates, and participants. So guys, today's session is going to be very awesome. So there has to be some ground rules before we start and before we call upon the speaker. So since the session is going to be so awesome, you need to be 100% switched on and from mentally to listen to everything. I know you all had lunch just now, so be 100% switched on. Secondly, be in a good networking zone. Your network should not fluctuate for today. You cannot afford it, you know. Thirdly, please keep yourself in mute because it may disturb the speaker and other participants. And fourthly, if you have any questions, you can always use the chat box to inbox your questions, and we will be answering all the questions in the last of the session. So before I introduce the speaker, let me tell you a few words about the speaker. As the name says, Jolly, and she is a very passionate, very jolly person from heart, mind, and soul. And seriously telling you about her, she loves to serve the humanity from heart. She is a very passionate teacher and a skilled intensivist. She did her graduation and post-graduation from a very prestigious institute of CMC Vellore. She is author to many national and international publications. And she is a very skilled intensivist, a very skilled intensivist, I will say. And currently she is serving as associate professor in CMC Vellore. So without wasting much of the time, I would like to call upon stage, virtual stage, Dr. Jolly Chandran, ma'am. Ma'am, please, over to you.
Thank you, Tanuj, for those kind words, and thank you, sir. So I'll be speaking about airway management. All of us know that airway management is a part and parcel of intensive care and also anesthesiologists. It's very important for pediatricians to know as well, because most of the time in most of the hospitals, you'll be the first one to manage a sick child if you're around alone. So going on to the talk, my scope of talk would be I'll look at airway adjuncts. Yesterday, you all have listened to oxygen delivery devices. So today I'll go through some airway adjuncts that is very essential for us to know. Rapid sequence intubation steps, the drugs that are to be used, ET size and fixation methods, and physiological difficult airway. So what exactly is airway adjuncts? Basically, these are equipments which are designed to address airway obstruction and free the airway. They are equipments which create and maintain the airway patency, and at the same time, it also allows spontaneous respiration and facilitates bag and mask ventilation. So if we look at oropharyngeal airway, it's simply called as simple Guidel's airway. That is what is commonly used most of the time. So the main functions are it maintains airway patency, it facilitates bag mask ventilation, and it allows spontaneous respiration. Bottom line is it stents open the obstruction in the upper airway. So if we look at indications and contraindications, so usually we say unconscious or semi-conscious, because if there is gag reflex, that is one contraindication to use a oropharyngeal airway. Other indications to use are Pierre-Robin sequence, when you have difficulty in bag mask ventilation and you want to open up the airway, when you want to protect the tongue from writing, and also it helps in facilitating suction when you have a lot of oral secretion. So the presence of gag reflex can stimulate vomiting, and the resistance by the child, both together can result in mucosal injury. So if we look at parts of oropharyngeal airway, what you all see at the broad end, it's called flange. It's the white portion, and the flange is present to limit the depth of insertion, so it does not move into the mouth. And there is a reinforced bite block segment. So that is usually color coded, and the different colors are for different sizes. There's always a rigid curved body, and mostly it's tapered in the edge. That is also, again, it is smooth there to prevent mucosal trauma. So these are the different sizes that are available. There are varying sizes from 000 for preterm babies up to, you can see, number 6. So it's not like by default, this is the size for this size baby. You always choose the size by the measurement. The measurement is from the angle of the mouth to the angle of the mandible. So in this slide, you can see the steps of insertion. Firstly, like I told you, you determine the responsiveness. So once you think patient is unresponsive, then you take a oropharyngeal airway and measure the distance to see which is the appropriate size. Once the correct size is selected, you open the mouth using something called a cross finger technique. You can see the index finger is on the upper lip and the thumb is on the lower lip, and you're able to kind of angle it and anchor your hand there trying to open the mouth. So this method of insertion, where you can see it's placed other way around, and then you go into the mouth and turn it around 180 degrees. What we need to understand is currently most of the places less than 8-year-old, you do not practice this method. In infants and children, you try to open the mouth and use a tongue depressor. This is mainly to avoid insult or injury to the soft palate. Whereas in adult, the concave side can be up and you pass to the back of the hard palate and then you rotate 180 degrees. In children, you can use a tongue depressor and you can insert it directly. So essentially, steps of insertion are, after you assess the responsiveness, you position the head, measure the size, use a tongue depressor and insert it gently. So does it really matter what size of oropharyngeal airway you're using? So it does matter if it is small or large. Like you can see in this picture onto your left side, it is actually a large airway and it's actually going in and occluding your airway. And when it is small, it pushes on the tongue, and then that also can result in blocking of airway. There are many other types. Few of them are called Berman's pharyngeal airway, but common one that is used is the Griebel's, like I mentioned. So few helpful tips. Oropharyngeal airways, they do not prevent aspiration. So having that does not secure you or tell you that you will not have aspiration. If not inserted properly, it can cause obstruction. So that is what you need to remember at the end of oropharyngeal airway. So moving on to the other commonly used adjunct, nasopharyngeal airway. It restores airway patency, it allows spontaneous respiration, and it facilitates bag mask ventilation. Essentially, it's the same thing that an oropharyngeal airway does. But here it also stents open the nasopharyngeal part of the airway instead of just the upper airway. It's also called nasal trumpet, it's also called nasal hose, and it's designed to sit in the nasal passageway to secure an open airway. Indications are again unconscious children, gag reflex. Even if it is present, you can use nasopharyngeal airway. That is the advantage because you're not stimulating the palate from the oropharyngeal area. And when some children, they're not tolerating oropharyngeal airway, then this is an indication. And also difficulty in bag mask ventilation, it does help, especially small infants and neonatal babies. This is a good alternative when you don't have a good chest rise. Contraindications are facial trauma and of course nasal developmental anomaly like choanal atresia and stenosis, bleeding disorders because the nasal mucosa is quite vascular and fragile, and if we do a difficult insertion and there's bleeding disorders, it can result in quite nasty bleeding. So how do we measure the size? Again, it is from the tragus to the lateral nostril. So you measure. These nasopharyngeal airways are manufactured by different companies. They're silicone based. You can even have the red rubber kind of nasopharyngeal airway. When all this is not available, you can use a simple endotracheal tube, an uncuffed one, and you can actually cut the edge and connect the hub of the endotracheal tube. I'll just show you later a picture of it. So steps of insertion. Again, always check the sensorium, measure the size, use good lubricant for the nasal mucosa to avoid any injury. Always the bevel has to face the septum and you follow the curvature of the nose, especially in small infants. As soon as you enter the nose, you will see you'll have to turn it down and follow the curvature. So this is a picture of an endotracheal tube being used. Commonly, when we want to use nasopharyngeal CPAP, this is what we do. So you disconnect the end and cut it, leaving around 4 centimeters if you want to use for any nasopharyngeal CPAP and connect the ventilator. So tip to remember is it can cause severe bleeds in coagulopathic patients. Hence, we need to be cautious. So moving on to rapid sequence intubation, what we'll be looking through in the next few minutes is what are the steps of RSI, what are the drugs that we can use, what are the tube sizes, and how do we fix it. So what is RSI? It's inducing a state of unconsciousness with complete neuromuscular paralysis in an effort to facilitate the intubation and minimizing the risk of gastric aspiration. Basically, it is intubation with drugs and neuromuscular blocking agents. So can you call it as a drug-assisted intubation? So any use of medication with or without NMDAs, that is neuromuscular blocking agents, come under drug-assisted intubation. So when do we do a RSI? All non-elective or semi-elective intubations. Patient must be spontaneously breathing. And then you go on for intubation and you plan. And of course, the emergency intubation we'll talk about when we come to it. So anytime when you prepare for a RSI, few questions you need to ask yourself. First of all is the intubation indicated at all? Is this a crash airway situation? When we say crash airway, patient is suddenly arrested or suddenly unexpectedly has lost his own airway. So that is where you need to consider, okay, is this that where I need to hurry up? Or is this a potentially difficult airway? So when we say potentially difficult airway, it can be anatomical or physiological. When we say anatomical, again, there are two things. Are you going to have difficulty in bag mask ventilation, or are you going to have difficulty in laryngoscopy view? And like I mentioned, is it physiologically difficult? Is RSI appropriate? And always you need to know, is this a failed airway? Has someone already attempted it before me and have they failed it? So more like in RSI, what we need to know is more like delayed sequence intubation. RSI is preferred when you are worried about an inevitable significant hypoxemia. You always consider a modified RSI. Why is you want to prevent a significant hypoxemia. At the same time, in children with pulmonary involvement, cardiac involvement, and shock, you want to be cautious when you're doing intubation. Here, you will ensure you've done pre-oxygenation followed by procedural sedation. What is crash intubation? It's reserved when patient is apneic, unresponsive, and pulseless. Actually, when ROSC is achieved and then you think that the blood pressures are picked up, you can actually plan a semi-elective RSI and you can decide about the drugs. Otherwise, this is generally called as cold intubation, where you go ahead to intubate without giving any drugs. What I want to emphasize is when you have a cardiac arrest, in arrest situation, your priority is only bag and mask with the ratio as per the infants and adults. There is no hurry to intubate and get your airway in unless and until you are unable to bag and mask the patient. Okay. So what are our goals of RSI? It's basically you want to create an ideal intubation condition. It facilitates and expedites your endotracheal intubation. There are a lot of studies that say that you have increased success rate when you provide an ideal environment by giving good drugs and preparing the patient. And also it decreases your time to intubate. So goals are you trying to attenuate your airway reflexes, minimize your ICP, maintain adequate blood pressure, makes an ideal condition for intubation with adequate sedation and paralysis so that you're not struggling to intubate. Like I said, it expedites your success rate. So few things we need to remember when we are going to do an intubation is always remember there can be difficult airways, which could be anatomical or physiological. You can have difficulty to ventilate as such, and always be careful of an upper airway obstruction. Full stomach and physiologic difficult airway are always a red alert that you need to be careful of. Do we have disadvantages with RSI? Definitely yes. The operator who is taking over will be assuming complete responsibility. The burden is on that person for oxygenation, ventilation, and maintaining the airway patency. And it's like an irreversible commitment. If you're given the drugs, you need to be sure that you're able to oxygenate and ventilate. And sometimes the medications that you give can have disastrous results. So three major assumptions that we go ahead and do when we are doing RSI are, one is the patient has a full stomach, the operator can intubate, and the operator can resuscitate. So one thing I've learned over the years is always treat an airway with respect. It's like you're not learning or practicing to pass an exam. You're preparing for the day when you're the only one who is between the patient and the grave, trying to get that airway in. At this point, supraglottic airways are your only grace marks. So, going on to drug components in RSI, when we say sedation, sedation is basically when you give a drug, it depresses the patient's awareness to environment and decreases his or her response. So what are the three components? One is you give pre-medication with lidocaine plus minus atropine or glycopyrrolate, and then you give a sedative or analgesic, and then you give a paralytic agent. The essence is whatever you give, you want rapid acting in a RSI. At the same time, they have all these together should have components of anxiolysis, amnesia, the child should forget whatever you have done, should not have any pain, and at the same time anesthesia. So all this, is it there in one single sedative? Is there an ideal sedative? I'm sure most of us would agree there's no ideal sedative. It all depends on how you tailor it to the patient. And most of these drugs, it depends on the dose and how the patient's physiologic status is. So the process of RSIs, all of you know there's something called 7 Ps. Of late, it's become 9 Ps or 10 Ps also. So it's preparation, pre-oxygenation, pre-treatment, paralysis with induction, protection and positioning, placement with proof that the ET tube is in, and post-intubation management. So the other 2 Ps that are included are protect the C-spine and pressure at the cricoid. The procedure itself, this chart I've taken from Life in Fastlane and Google. So if you see, it's always about preparing the patient. So you have 10 minutes prior to preparing, and then you have a countdown. So when you decide that you're going to intubate, it's the start of 10 minutes. Okay, you prepare the patient, you plan, you prepare, and then you start pre-oxygenating when you're down to 5 minutes. Then you start your pre-treatment when you have 3 minutes to go. And at 0 is when you give the paralysis, wait for the drug to act and go ahead and place the tube subsequently. And after that, you have your post-intubation management, which is an important component. So the key tip here is preparation with good planning. At the same time, you need to anticipate the difficulties. If you can do all this, that is your key to success. So why do we have to plan and prepare? So one of the thing is children's airway anatomy is always different from adults. So some people might find it that it's a difficult airway. So that's why it's like, okay, do I call it a difficult airway if I have a child who I have to intubate? You need to plan your team. You need to plan the drugs to give. You should always have a plan A and plan B. So the difference between a child's airway and the adult airway is children have different anatomy. The tongue is large, the epiglottis is floppy, it's omega shaped, so it keeps coming in the way. The larynx is funnel shaped and the narrowest part is subglottis. Okay, so because the children's airway is already higher and anterior placed, it keeps descending as you grow. It is difficult, especially if you haven't been used to intubating a child. So what do you plan in a team? Always a team leader. This is from AHA PALS. You have a resuscitation person. It's great if you have a scribe person. And for the airway team, you have a person intubating, an airway assistant, and a drug administrator. So ideally, you want 6 persons in a team, but at least a minimum of 3 to start intubation. And this is the same thing that has been recommended by the anesthesiologists as well. This has been published recently in the Journal of Anesthesia, where you have airway assistant, the person who is intubating is at the head end, and the team leader is always at the foot end. This triangle is called like triangle of life, where you have the airway person on one side, compressor on the right, and then you have the person who's in charge of the defibrillator, and they interchange. So what do we prepare? The commonly used mnemonic in intensive care is SOAP-ME, which is suction, oxygen, airway equipment, pharmacology, monitoring and equipment. When we say monitoring, it's pulse oximetry, ECG. At the same time, we need to remember another M is manpower. And what type of laryngoscope are you going to use? Is it Macintosh, which is the curved blade, and Miller, which is the straight blade? So let's look at the blades. Miller is thin and straight. It directly lifts the epiglottis to allow visualization of the cords. And usually infants and young children are always intubated with Miller blade because of the floppy airway, and they have better control of trunk. Actually, more than that, a default rule is whatever you're comfortable with is what you can use. Macintosh, the blades are wider and curved. So if you're used to it after infant period, you can start using it, especially for older children and even in infants, the smaller Macintosh blades. If you're comfortable, you can go ahead and use it. Usually it sits in the valvula to indirectly lift the epiglottis. So if you're new and you're doing intubations, it's safer to use a Miller blade because you go past the epiglottis and lift it up. There are different laryngoscopes. This is the video laryngoscope, or it's also called CMAC. It's very useful for people to see when you're intubating. It's a great scope for teaching. Other scopes are glide scopes, fiber optic laryngoscope, and also McCoy laryngoscope. I'm not going too much into it, just the basic. And this is something called a RSI dump sheet or a plan sheet. So we don't have it, but most of the Western countries have it. When you plan intubation, you have this spread out, and you can see that, you have the oropharyngeal airway, mask, ET tubes of different sizes, stylet, McGill's, and it also tells you which size of LMA when you go on to plan B. So it's quite a helpful guide so that when you plan and prepare, you don't forget things that you keep. This is another of the RSI dump sheet. So there's just touching on difficult airway kit. When you anticipate a difficult airway, especially if you think any anatomically difficult airway child, especially somebody with dysmorphism or a large tongue, this will have multiple blades and multiple ETTs. There'll be a stylet, bougie, and also something called a light wand. Also for emergency non-surgical ventilation, it has LMA, combi tube. Emergency surgical airway access, there's also cricothyroidotomy kit, and always ETT placement verification, a tiny end-tidal CO2 monitor, and fiber optic intubation. So why do we have to pre-oxygenate? We basically wash in with oxygen and wash out the nitrogen that is there residual in our lungs. Okay, so that is what we do. We are basically replacing the nitrogen with oxygen. You need 5 to 8 maximal inhalation or vital capacity breaths for normal lungs, or at least 5 minutes of 100% oxygen. Theoretically, it prevents desaturation less than 90% for at least 3 to 5 minutes during apnea intubation. So when there is less reserve, you might need more time to oxygenate well, and I'll talk about it in physiologic difficult airway. That is why we need to prepare better in children where we have other challenges. So there is evidence when you give oxygen during the apneic phase of intubation. This is called apneic oxygenation. Only 14% had desaturation versus 56% who were not given oxygenation. So of late, this has been an upcoming thing, especially in critically ill children. It is good to have apneic oxygenation started when you are going ahead and intubating. So what's the size of ET tube that will use. The useful formula, this is from the AHA PALS guidelines. It's age in years by 4 plus 4. And for cuff tube, it's half a size smaller. Depth of insertion is age in years by 2 plus 12. Or an easy formula is internal diameter into 3. If you're skilled and you are very good in intubation and confident, when you go in, look at the glottic guide. That is a dark black ring on the endotracheal tube. You can keep the glottic guide at the level of the vocal cords. So which tube do we use, cuffed or uncuffed? Previously, the traditional teaching used to be less than 8 years, you don't use cuff tube, and only more than 8 years you use cuff tube because you're worried about subglottic edema. But now, with advancement of medicine, you have high volume, low pressure cuffs. They're basically these tiny cups. They are low pressures. You keep the pressure less than 25 centimeter water. So previously it used to be called the Kimberly-Clark tube. Now it's been taken over by the company Avnos, and it's available. It comes to around 1,000 to 1,500 rupees based on where you are getting it. And so with these being available, even small babies, we actually intubate with micro cuff tubes. They're called micro cuffed. So if we are worried about a pneumonia and we think we'll have issues with ventilation, we go ahead by intubating with the cuff tubes. Next is going on to medication. So why do we have to give any sedative or paralytic? So the reason is there's something called the intubation reflex. When we are going to intubate, there's a catecholamine release in response to the laryngeal manipulation when we put in the laryngoscope. You can have tachycardia, hypertension, raised ICP. When you give drugs, fentanyl especially can attenuate it, and ICP rise can be brought down by lidocaine, especially in children where you are doing neuroprotective intubation. Studies have shown midazolam and thiopental don't have much effect for this intubation reflex. When we look at all the drugs for pre-treatment, followed by paralysis and induction, you have atropine. It's given at a dose of 0.02 milligram per kilo. It's to prevent vagal bradycardia, and also it limits secretion. But by default, most of the time we do not use it because it can actually mask a hypoxic bradycardia. So that is one reason that we don't use it. Benzodiazepines and opioids, small dose fentanyl, it can blunt the sympathetic response, and it's very helpful in agitated children. So the reason you always give a small dose and then repeat the doses in small infants, they can actually result in chest rigidity. So that's the reason you always give a 1 mic per kilo slowly and then repeat the dose when you need. Lignocaine, it mitigates bronchospasm and reactive airway disease, and also decreases ICP response, suppresses the cough reflex. It's given at a dose of 1 to 1.5 milligram per kilo. And there's something called defasciculation dose. This is given with vecuronium, non-depolarizing muscle relaxant, to prevent muscle fasciculation and also to reduce the gastric pressure. So the question always is, what sedative do I give? Do I give midazolam, fentanyl, ketamine, propofol, or thiopental? Or do I just not get confused and not give anything? The reason is, why do we have to choose is because we have a lot of options nowadays. For emergency RSI, it's very crucial to select the sedative. Generally, it obtains the patient to point of loss of protective reflexes and respiratory drive. So evidence has shown the success rate varies from 25% of successful intubation in out of hospital to 72% in hospital. And when you actually prepare them well with the ideal sedative, the success rates are as high as 95%. So what is preferred when you have hemodynamic worry? Then you prefer fentanyl, ketamine. The ones in green that you can see I've put up are all preferred drugs. For neuroprotection, propofol, thiopental, and midazolam in a small dose. For bronchodilation, ketamine. Rapid, when you want to have a rapid intubation, propofol is a great drug. We are always worried in small infants because we are worried about drop in blood pressure. And you need to avoid when you're worried the child already has hypotension. Definitely you try to avoid propofol. Like I told you, one way to remember is we say propofol is profound fall in blood pressure. At a big dose, a small dose, definitely when there is hypotension, you always try to avoid it. In neuroprotection, previously it used to be said you avoid ketamine, but current evidence, even in TBI guidelines, one dose will not cause any alteration. But at the same time, in chronic heart diseases, you do not give ketamine. In acute, it is okay. In chronic, you don't give because they already have depleted catecholamine stores. When you want rapidity of action, you always are cautious when you give midazolam. It can take 2 to 3 minutes to act fully. And in patients who have been given naloxone, you avoid fentanyl. So this is all the drugs in a table form. So fentanyl in the dose of 0.5 to 2 mics per kilo. It has rapid onset of action, short acting. It's reversible with naloxone. Cautions are, like I told you, you can have chest wall rigidity with rapid administration. It can be quite scary. You will have to give a paralytic agent sometimes to revert it and to have a good chest rise. Midazolam dose is 0.1 to 0.3 milligram per kilo. It provides amnesia. That is another reason you always give a small dose of midazolam when you are doing a semi-elective intubation. You have additive respiratory depression when it is combined with a narcotic, and it does not provide analgesia. We do not use much of etomidate, but it's commonly used in some hospitals. It provides hypnosis. So lignocaine dose, like I mentioned before, 1 to 1.5 milligram per kilo. It blunts hemodynamic and tracheal response to intubation. It reduces the elevation of ICP during laryngoscopy. You should not give a very high dose because you can actually result in neurotoxicity and seizures. Ketamine, dose of 1 to 4 milligram per kilo. It has rapid onset, no adverse cardiovascular effects in acute setup. It's short acting, may increase ICP, but one dose will not cause much of elevation. You can always, you consider a small dose of benzodiazepine. It's a great drug actually when you want to intubate. Same with propofol, rapid onset, short acting, provides amnesia, but it can cause severe hypotension in volume depleted patients. So main tip to remember is you need to tailor the sedative to the patient. You see what type of patient you have, and then you decide on what to do. Quickly about neuromuscular blocking agents, you have depolarizing and non-depolarizing. So you have succinylcholine, as you all know, and non-depolarizing, what we use commonly are VEC, ROC, and atracurium. Nowadays, there's cis-atracurium. It's caused lesser side effects. At the same time, it's quite expensive as well. So the dose of succinylcholine is 1.5 milligram per kilo. Onset is very quick, 45 to 60 seconds, and it lasts for around 6 to 10 minutes. Disadvantage is you can have bradycardia and you can have fasciculation. So when you want to use sux in a small infant, especially less than 5 years, is when you have to give the pre-medication, a defasciculation dose of vecuronium that I told before at 0.1 mg per kg. That helps in preventing fasciculation and reducing the gastric pressure as well. And succinylcholine can cause hyperkalemia and malignant hyperthermia as well. Atracurium is a nice drug to use. Onset is 60 to 90 seconds. Duration lasts for around 45 minutes. It relatively has lesser effect on the cardiovascular system. Disadvantage is it causes histamine release. So when is succinylcholine contraindicated is always a question that you think of. So do you use it? Commonly here we don't. if you don't use it, what else can you use? You can give rock or vec for atra. If using sucks, do you have to give atropine? Ideally, yes, to prevent the bradycardia. And if you're using it, you always give a defacicillin dose. The other two drugs are vecuronium and rocuronium. Roc is used very commonly in most of the ICUs. The dose is 0.6 to 1.2 milligram per kilo. Onset is 60 to 90 seconds. So essentially, when you give these drugs, you always wait for 1.5 minutes, 1 to 1.5 minutes. The advantage is it's as rapid as sucks. It's much quicker than atra and vec. Disadvantage, we all know, long duration, more expensive. Vecuronium, you can prime with 1/10 of the dose prior, or you can go ahead and give this bolus dose of 0.1 to 0.2 milligram per kilo. Again, vecuronium has hepatic clearance. So if you have a patient with liver failure, then you avoid using vecuronium. Both vecuronium and atracurium have histamine release. So you try to avoid them when you are intubating a patient with asthma. The next important thing is protection and positioning. Basically, you need to look for a neutral sniffing position without hyperextension of the neck. This is mainly appropriate for infants and toddler. So this is the sniffing position where you have to extend the neck and at the same time you have to flex at the C-spine. So always remember, we position for the external auditory meatus should be in line with the anterior shoulder. The reason we do that is we try to get the three axes, that is the oral axis, pharyngeal axis, and the laryngeal axis into commonly joining into a accessible line. So you can see only when we position well and extend well, you're getting it in that line. So this is a nice image I got. So you can see that positioning, keeping a head roll or a shoulder roll is different for different children. So infants, you try to keep a shoulder roll. Older children, you keep a head roll. Okay, and small child, you might even just not keep any roll. All this is you're trying to get the head into a neutral position. Like I told you, you want to get all the three axes together. Another key thing to remember is you're trying to get the external auditory meatus in straight line. Okay. So the next thing is to, when you go on to intubate, there's something called protection. It's basically, it is modifying to bring the cords to view. It's also called Sellick's maneuver. Previously, it used to be recommended. Now, actually, some people do not even recommend Sellick's maneuver, saying it can actually stimulate some vagal response. You basically identify the cricoid cartilage, and you can use thumb and index finger. The mnemonic to remember is BUR. Backwards, upward, right, and posterior. You basically push down gently. This is done by a second person, and the person who is intubating will be able to tell how much exactly that you want them to do the movement, because sometimes if they are quite enthusiastic and do a significant work, the vocal cord might go quite posterior and you might have difficulty in viewing. And usually you do it gently and you release it only after the tube position is confirmed to prevent any aspiration. Okay, so that is the logic behind it. And also in small newborn, you don't need a second person. You can use your little finger and do that yourself. So placement with proof, as soon as you go in, this is the anatomy. You can see the epiglottis, and then you can see the glottis. You see the arytenoid cartilage, okay, the vallicula. So the curved tube, you keep the curved laryngoscope. You place the scope in the vallicula. Once you visualize the cord, you place the tube. And with proof, we say is if you have an end-tidal available, you use the end-tidal. Otherwise, you go by clinical examination. So this is another picture of the anatomy of the cords. I'll just share a video.
In this short video,
we are going to show about the airway management in children. That is endotracheal intubation. The procedure will be demonstrated by Dr. Jolly Chandran, Associate Professor, and assisted by Mrs. Rekha, Senior Critical Care Therapist in PICU. Over to Dr. Jolly.
Thank you. As you all have heard till now, the intubation procedure starts by our 7 P's. So the first one is planning and preparation. As we have planned that we are going to intubate this child, preparation comes by setting up our trolley with all the needed equipments. So it starts with the anatomical mask of different sizes, and we would like to choose the mask that is appropriate for the patient. Airway adjuncts like oropharyngeal airway and nasopharyngeal airway. Endotracheal tubes, always calculate the size that is needed and have one size smaller. A stellate, a syringe to inflate the cuff, lubricant, and laryngoscopes, both straight blade and curved blade as well. Suction catheter, we always prefer a large wide bore suction catheter, that is Yonkers, and also the most importantly for airway, bag and mask ventilation, the self-inflating Ambu bag and the flow-inflating Jackson-Rees circuit or BINS. So here now we have prepared the equipments and the medications that is needed. For pre-treatment, we have kept fentanyl, ketamine, and for paralysis, we have atracurium ready. Now, last but not the least, we would need a stethoscope to always check the position after placement of tube. So, planning and preparation is done. We will start by pre-oxygenating the patient. Connect the oxygen tubing to the flow meter. So, position the patient by EC clamp technique. Start pre-oxygenating by bag and mask ventilation. As we do the bag and mask ventilation, look for good chest rise. If there is no chest rise, always reposition, do a suction or use airway adjuncts. After pre-oxygenation, we can do protection by using the tripod pressure, which is backward, upward, right and posterior in children. But here for management purposes, we are not doing the procedure. We will go on straight to placement of tube. So this is the video laryngoscope, also called as CMAC. We'll be using this as this is useful for teaching. It's a very good intubation equipment, also useful in difficult airways.
Now you are able to see the oral cavity with the teeth. Going further, you are seeing the uvula. And the tip of the laryngoscope is going to sit in the vallicula. The sitting at the tip of the laryngoscope is sitting at the vallicula. And this is the epiglottis. Epiglottis, you are able to see the vocal cords and in between the tracheal opening. And this is the arytenoid cartilage and the pyriform fossa. I repeat, the tip of the laryngoscope is sitting at the vallicula. You are seeing the epiglottis, vocal cords, and the tracheal opening, arytenoid cartilages with the pyriform fossa in between. And you are seeing this esophageal opening is below this.
Okay, now placement of the tube, you always go from the corner of the angle of the mouth, holding the ET tube like a pencil. Remove the laryngoscope, we remove the stellate and we check for tube position. That is the next P, which is placement of tube. This is done by bagging and doing the 5-point auscultation technique, which is on both the apical region, right side, then left base, the right base, and the epigastric region. We can also look for misting of the tube. And last but not the least, we can use end-tidal CO2 monitor and then later chest X-ray. So we will now fix the tube. We will show you the methods of fixation of tube. There are two methods of cutting the tape. These are the simple long strips. We can also cut them as the single strip with just a cut in between. It's called trouser legs. And then you can fix it at the base and go around and tape. We will show the easy method by these two simple strip technique. The person who has intubated will hold on to the airway. So the first tape is stuck at the cheek, goes around at the mark where we want the ET tube to be placed, and then it's taken around and fixed at the cheek. The other piece is used to secure it to the other side of the mouth. And on the lower part of the chin. After confirmation of tube position, we will continue post-intubation care, just showing you the flow inflating bag. So it needs a constant flow of oxygen. There is a PEEP valve and this is a viral filter. So we can adjust the PEEP valve. And so only with the flow the bag will inflate, and this would actually cause easier hand ventilation when we want to continue ventilation, and also adequate delivery of PEEP, especially when we are worried about children who we are worried about hypoxemia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing that. Okay, so we'll continue. The procedure of intubation was demonstrated with the video laryngoscope. It's such an advantage to have the newer laryngoscope. It's very useful for teaching. So next important point is to confirm tube position. We should always rule out a esophageal intubation by breath sounds, or if capnography is available, that is the end-tidal, you can use that. Always listen over the epigastrium after listening to the chest. These are actually bedside procedures. It must be done immediately after intubation prior to doing a chest X-ray. So you auscultate, you look for bilateral chest rise, tube location at the teeth. Exactly, you can follow the formula and check. Sometimes when we are anxious and we've intubated, we end up putting in the tube quite a bit. So then we will think there's no air entry on one side. So it's important, paramount importance to look at the location of the tube and a CO2 detector if it's available. Also the misting of the tube. In small infants, sometimes it might not be obvious. On chest X-ray, you want the ET tube to be placed midway between T2 to T4 level, that is the middle third of trachea. Or simple way is if you can track the carina and it's visible, it has to be 1 to 1.5 centimeter above the carina. So when we said auscultation, this is called the 5-point auscultation method. You auscultate both infraclavicular area and both inframammary, and then the gastric area. So this will help you to ensure where the ET tube is placed. You will be able to recognize if it is too deep on one side or if it's a gastric intubation. Then comes to fixing of the tube. We just described in the video. So you can cut the plaster as bifid or tripod. Like I said, it's called trouser leg cutting, and you ensure you fix the tube well. So important tip is when you're positioning, you position the external acoustic meatus parallelly to the sternal notch and face as horizontal as possible. So that should be your goal when you're positioning. You want kind of a horizontal, easy airway where you have the external acoustic meatus that is parallel to the sternal notch, so that all your three axes are aligned. And never forget to position optimally before intubation. The 30 seconds to 1 minute that you will spend in positioning a child by either placing a shoulder roll or a head roll and extending the head will actually be a good time saving measure, especially if we don't position well and we end up in a failed airway. And most important thing is always protect the tube. I keep telling my registrars and fellows, you hold on to the ET tube like it is your airway and you're breathing through it. So there are studies that actually show when you have these unplanned tube coming out, it can result in higher mortality. Subsequent days after intubation, it's actually a quality marker for ICU. So again, the fixation technique. Just few words on what is difficult mask ventilation. When you're unable to keep the mask and oxygenate the child, then you think about difficult mask ventilation. First thing you do is you optimize the head position, do a good oral suction, and try to use a oropharyngeal airway. All this simultaneously you call for help and you continue giving 100% oxygen. Your second line here, like I mentioned earlier, your grace marks is laryngeal mask airway. If it is available, it's brilliant. The other important terminology to remember is cannot intubate and cannot oxygenate. At least the previous one, when you're unable to, when you're having difficulty in ventilation, then you try positioning. With that, if you're able to get a good chest rise and oxygenate, you can wait for help to come to help you in intubation. But if you can't intubate and at the same time you cannot oxygenate, then it is actually a nightmare for us. You attempt oxygenation, you call for help, then you try to think if you can wake up the patient by any reversal. If you have LMA, you try LMA, and you might result in surgical airway. So call for help. So here, if anesthesiologists are available and at the same time ENT, if you want to call, you can call ENT as well. So the consideration is, what if you can't intubate? So first you stop. You will retry in the same attempt only if your saturation is stable. Otherwise, you oxygenate the child well and then have your next attempt. And always remember, you bag and mask the child if the saturation falls. When you are retrying, always call simultaneously for help because they might take time to come. If you're worried about you having given a long-acting paralytic agent, then you consider reversal, especially if you're unable to intubate. Post-intubation checks, first thing is you check the position, you recheck the position, you start ventilating. Make sure the hemodynamics are fine because as soon as you give the drugs, there will be a lot of loss of vasomotor tone and child can start dropping blood pressure. And if you have to shift from emergency to the ICU, prepare to transport immediately. Ensure documentation is done. If you can do a blood gas, well and good, and chest X-ray if it's available, especially if you're planning to transport over a distance. Important tip to remember is if you're having trouble when you done scopy and you're unable to intubate, then probably you need to rethink where you went wrong, change something, don't do the same position again and try. So try to reposition, make sure you're well oxygenated and then go in and try to think why was the previous attempt a failure? Was it something to do with the position or is it a very anteriorly placed cord or is there something else that I'm missing out? And at the same time, watch out for hypoxemia, hypotension. I'll just show a few scenarios. First is a 14-year-old boy. He's consumed the poison. He's come with low GCS. He has decreased sensorium. His pupils are constricted. For a 14-year-old, he's tachycardic and his blood pressure is 70 on 50. He has shallow breathing at 14 per minute. And on oxygen, his SATs are 99%. So here, am I going to do a crash intubation? Or what sedative do I give? Can I give midazolam or ketamine? Can I use SUX, rock, or atracurium? So here, a few things to remember is one, he's come with loss of consciousness and you're worried he might have raised ICP, or you don't know if the sensorium is because of the poison. So if you have hypertonic saline available, it's good to give. If you are worried about the ICP, if lignocaine is available, that is good to give to blunt the ICP response. Ketamine with atracurium or rock, and it has to be a full RSI because he's consumed poison and come, you don't know his gastric or nilperoral status. So when do you think about modified RSI here? When you're anticipating a difficult airway, when you're worried about severe hypoxemia with poor compliance, where you think bagging might not be easy, and you think neuromuscular blocking agents cannot be given because you're worried about the blood pressure, how much sedation do I give? So sedation in these circumstances, when it comes to modified RSIs and at the same time a sick child, like I said, you tailor it to the patient. So you give sedation as per anticipated tolerance. So you can always give a small dose and you can give more, but if you give more, you cannot take it out. So it's always safety in these kind of situations before comfort. So we look at this 14-year-old with severe status asthmaticus for 8 hours. He's again tachycardic. His blood pressure is 100 on 80. His SATs are 99%. He's been getting nebulized for the last 4 hours. But as you go to him, he's agitated, he's sweaty, he's fighting. Then again, your question is, what do I give? Do I intubate him? So again, do I do a modified RSI on him? And you go ahead, you choose your drugs of ketamine, thinking he is asthmatic, it'll help in bronchodilation. You've tried avoiding atra, you've given rocuronium, but after you intubate, his blood pressure crashes down from 100 on 80 to 70 on 50. And then you're thinking, okay, why did this happen? One is, till now he's been awake, he's been having a compensatory response. So suddenly you have the loss of sympathetic drive. And also he's been ill for the last 24 hours. He might be low on fluids. So hypovolemia also gets unmasked. And in somebody with asthma who's already in severe status asthmaticus, we've intubated, always consider tension pneumothorax as one of the differential, and also autopy. So autopy will also result in decreased return, and again you can have hypotension. And also always check if somebody had just given a magnesium sulfate, that can also cause hypotension. So we need to be aware of all this and be prepared when we are give a fluid bolus. If you have an ultrasound available, you can look for pneumothorax, otherwise an urgent chest x-ray. So these are things that we need to do. And for air trapping, you can disconnect the endotracheal tube. In severe hypotension due to air trapping, you can actually squeeze the chest and let the air out. This is a cardiac child with Epstein's anomaly who's again come to you with tachycardia and hypotension. So he's 14-year-old and his blood pressure is only 70 on 50. So about 10 years, you expect a systolic blood pressure of 90. He's also got gallop, he's got a large liver, he's cyanose, he's saturating 75% on room air, and after you give him 100% oxygen, he's saturating 82%. So here it's important to know what his baseline SATs are, and his parents say his SATs were 85% at home. So again, you're worried, is it going to be a crashed intubation? What do I give? Can I give midas, fentanyl, ketamine, or propofol, succinylcholine, rocuronium, vecuronium, or nothing? So here it would be optimizing the child. So for the hypotensive shock, give a small fluid bolus, 5 ml per kilo slowly. Start having inotrope running. So it's called inotrope on board. Connect it, have it going. You support oxygen with NIV till you stabilize. This whole preparation here, instead of the 10 minutes to count down, can even take 30 minutes to 45 minutes or even 1 hour. But you try and prepare and try to do some stabilization before you intubate. And you can give a small dose of fentanyl and vecuronium. The reason I did not say ketamine is he's a chronic congestive cardiac failure, heart disease. They will have depleted catecholamine stores. The next is a child who's come to you in septic shock. He's got fever, respiratory distress, bilateral infiltrates, hypotensive, and has got hypoxemia as well. He's been on non-rebreathing face mask and he's only saturating 88. So even the previous child, where all these children, what we are worried about is something called physiologically difficult airway. And that is the reason, even for the previous child, I said, you need to stabilize gently before you go ahead and intubate. Okay, so what are we going on talking about this physiologic difficult airway? I'll explain in the subsequent slides. So can you give sedative here? Can you give, do you give ketamine? Do I give a paralytic agent? Do I intubate? So if it is a child with low counts, who is an oncology child, immunosuppressed, I will probably try NIV till I stabilize the child a bit. At the same time, when you give these drugs, you try to give half the dose and be prepared with adrenaline. You'll have adrenaline as inotrope running. Some anesthetists and intensivists even practice giving a small dose, a 1/10 dose of adrenaline bolus before giving this sedative and paralytic agent to prevent rapid deterioration. So compared to the asthmatic, what is different in this child? Here we know that the lungs are bad. We'll need escalation of oxygen therapy plus fluid and inotrope. And like I mentioned, a small adrenaline bolus. Can we do anything else for this hypoxemia? When I told about pre-oxygenation, I mentioned something about apneic oxygenation. So that would be a good choice here so that you have continuous inflow of oxygen as you make your attempt. So usually, like I mentioned, this preparation will take around 15 to 30 minutes and even as long as 45 minutes. So what exactly is physiological difficult airway? It's basically where you have physiologic derangements. It places the patient as at a higher risk of cardiovascular collapse with intubation and converting them to positive pressure ventilation. So 3 important factors to remember are hypoxemia, hypotension, and severe metabolic acidosis. So hypoxemia, when you have high risk for rapid desaturation during intubation, especially when you have lung involvement, it can result in hemodynamic instability and subsequent hypoxic brain injury. You can also have cardiopulmonary arrest. So apneic oxygenation, it's also called as diffusion respiration, or some people call it as aventilatory mass flow. Basically, because the oxygen removal happens from the alveoli by circulating blood, by bringing the alveolar pressure down to subatmospheric level, it generates a negative pressure. So when you give apneic oxygenation, actually you can still have oxygen getting absorbed there. And that is the reason you give it. This helps in giving you a slighter edge by allowing lesser desaturation than not using apneic phase oxygen. So the desaturation, when all the evidence has shown, when you normally have desaturation risk of 56%, if you use apneic phase of oxygen delivery, it actually brings it down to 14%. So that's quite a significant reduction. So that is the importance of doing it. So pre-oxygenation and apneic oxygenation should be performed in all critically ill children. The other thing to remember is hypotension. So 25% will develop transient hypotension after you intubate. How can you overcome it? You can give fluid bolus, you can have inotrope started. In very sick children, you can give small doses of adrenaline. Common causes are volume depletion, capillary leak, It's basically loss of vascular tone. And also in children who are septic and cardiac, they can have myocardial depression. In patients who have extremely high minute ventilation requirement, they are at a high risk for developing relative hypoventilation. So they go on to develop poor perfusion and shock, which will add on to metabolic acidosis. So that is a significant risk factor as well. And acidosis can worsen cardiac function. So key is you remember, you always resuscitate before you intubate. So your questions, you'll ask yourself, do I intubate now or after stabilizing a little bit? Or it's called resuscitation. Do I have high oxygenation deficit? Then I need to address it by giving apneic oxygen. Do I have high ventilation deficit? That is your CO2 washout. And also at the same time, do I have metabolic acidosis? Do I have perfusion deficit? Then I give volume replacement. So when you have these children deteriorating from relatively well to sick, you try to stabilize them a little bit before you intubate so that they don't crash and arrest. So the key message here is you need to know your patient, because most of what you do here, like your sedatives, you tailor to the patient, your airway adjuncts, you need to pick the right size. If you're thinking about a difficult airway, you need to know your patient. You always anticipate difficulty, call for help, and always have protocols. Like when you plan, always have what to do next. What is your plan B? Who do I call? And you have all this ready so that we can have successful airway placement. So thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Tanuj, just one minute is Sudho joined. Sudhasata, I'm happy to welcome you
Yes.
again. Dr. Sudhasata Ghosh,
Thank you,
clinical
sir.
fellow at cardiac intensive care unit Royal Brompton, and she's connected from UK. She was a lot of alumni in pediatric fellowship in pediatric intensive care at CMC. Welcome you, Sudho. Now over to you,
Thank
both
you.
Tanuj and Sudha, to moderate the sessions. And
So it was well heard. I missed the beginning part because I was not able to connect. But Jolly Mum, as usual, blasted the entire performance. And yes, we should always know our patient. That's our training. During our training, we got to know that KYP, you have to know your patient. And Hop Killers was the motto of whenever we intubated. So yes, it was very nice teaching from Jolly ma'am. Excellent, well done presentation. Over to Tanuj, please.
Yes, I really agree with you, and I like that slide very much. That being an intensivist, we are the only person between a patient and his grave. So we need to be very responsible, and we need to be well trained. More is basically a mental training. So it was a very good talk from Jolly ma'am, full of wisdom. Thank you so much, ma'am.
any questions from the audience? Because it's more a practical topic for discussion. So if you have encountered or if facing any patients similar to the cases Jolly has posted, and over to you guys. And Tanuj and Sudho, you can share your experience as well. All about pediatric airway.
So we many a time I see a very young chap struggling with the intubation. Like I was in the initial days when Jolly ma'am used to teach us hands on hand. So initial days we used to struggle intubation, and being in now in practice, I realize that mental preparation is more important, and the kind of teaching we get as leading a team and being a part of team is very crucial part of intubation. As the diagram that showed various people standing with the patient, and that was a very beautiful diagram. And standing on the other side of intubation, we as a student and a young fellow, we don't understand the importance that much in the initial days. But now in practice, we understand how much important it is to work in a team.
Yeah, Tanuj. So that is very important. See, practice, practice, practice. That's the
Yes.
main dictum, and having the see. We usually will see all these procedure. See one, do one, and teach one. But as you are saying, you are the person who are standing between the gap, probably for the patient and
Yes.
their destiny. So we have to be very careful. That's what nowadays the simulation has come into that. See, people may ask in intubating in a dummy, what is happening? Are you it's the same as human? No, it's not. But it gives you a lot of confidence. You follow the same standard operating procedures as she was mentioning about the P's, 7 P's or 10 P's, whatever you keep in your, you cannot take it for granted, you know. She was mentioning that you always keep airways with respect, because it's very very important. You cannot take it. That's what always in any ICUs you'll have a practice of having two doctors to be present and follow these steps very carefully, and knowing your patient, KYP. So that's the well said about that. Yes, KYP, knowing your environment and anticipate and plan, call for help. All these crisis resource principles are very important in this. So I'm really glad that Jolly touched all these important points, and as well as you need to know your anatomy, you need to know your physiology, you need to know the functional aspects of this patient when you are doing the procedure. It was really good. Any questions you can ask, please?
Yeah, the one question to Jolly ma'am. If a child,
Yeah.
since this is on a COVID-19 preparedness, so
Yeah.
we had one patient with PIMS TS with cardiomyopathy and came in very shock, cardiogenic shock with high inotropic support. We put on ECMO, the child collapsed ultimately after 48 hours. So my question is, when the child comes in such PMTS with the background of COVID and has a severe dilated biventricular failure, LV dysfunction, global hypokinesia, how do we take intubation over there? I mean, it is
So first of all, it depends on where you are. Okay, so if you're in a center where ECLS is available, even for us now here, if we have a very sick child with like a cardiomyopathy, like you're saying, we know the reason here with PIMS TS. I would actually have the ECMO team ready when I'm going ahead to intubate. And here it's again a physiologic difficult airway. So I'll actually try and stabilize. If the patient is on NIV, I will have the inotropes going. I'll have the ECLS team ready, and then I will give my drugs. So choice of drugs, again, this is a acute scenario. So if I were to use, I would just use ketamine under half the dose of paralytic agent, like, very judiciously give it, and then be careful when I'm intubating, being very well prepared that I know that this child might arrest. 80% child might arrest with such poor cardiac function. And like you said, child is in cardiogenic shock. So in case, in the event of an arrest, we are all prepared to go on to a artificial circulatory support. But if you're in a place where you don't have the support, then I will take my time in trying to stabilize and get help, like 30 to 45 minutes. I'll make sure the inotrope is given. It's actually quite a good habit to give a small dose of adrenaline. I might just give the adrenaline bolus before giving the drugs. And many of us think peri-intubation arrest, the PERI that is called, it happens just when you tube. It's not just when you tube. Anything that happens around that time for the next 10 to 30 minutes, it's all a result of our intubation. So even after we give the drugs and intubate, it's very important to continue your hemodynamic support and be aware of what can happen standing at the bedside. So one of
Thank you.
the difficult airway that we talked, that I didn't probably put in the slide, is a physician difficult airway, where
Yeah.
you're actually extremely stressed out.
Yes. Yes.
Other than the adrenaline that you're giving the patient, your adrenaline levels are high. So we need to just first prepare, have a clear plan, and then okay, even if I fail, this is my next plan. Who will I call? So that will give you a lot of safety, or a lot of calmness And eventually, as you keep doing more, you get more and more confident. So, and just the fact knowing that another senior is around also gives you more confidence.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Chalima.
What did you do, Sudho, for this patient at your center while intubating?
I think.
So we have protocols for each and everything over here. So here, sir, the procedural sedation, we intubated this child with ketamine. We normally give etomidate in a severely critically ill patients here. So we did that because what we practice in CMC, we never used etomidate at all. But here the guidelines are different. Here we use ketamine, etomidate, and we paralyzed. So in severely critically ill patient, the protocol here is to give muscle paralysis as well as analgesia and sedation both. And what we haven't used is etomidate with what I am giving stressful. So we use etomidate in this patient, though we know it causes adrenergic suppress and all that and causes seizures, but we use it over here. So we intubated with that. And then within 24 hours, I mean, within 12 hours, the child was on ECMO. But since the child had already had a very severe dilated cardiomyopathy with the ejection fraction of 10 to 12%, he didn't make it.
Yeah, absolutely. See, in Western countries, you have the luxury of having the CPR or whatever ECMO quickly. See, we do have, but it will take about 6 to 8 hours to come into initiation. That's the time lag is there.
Yes.
And about etomidate, the problem with us is sepsis is quite a common thing, and we have not used it part of the sepsis protocol. And yes, I do agree it is otherwise a good. And paralyzing agent also, I will be very hesitant to use here
Yes.
without all this, because it will take away all the
All the drive.
vasomotor and whatever the BP which you have, also it will just go away, right?
Yeah.
So it is a very, very tricky and a critical situation, especially those who are hearing, those who are in the near peripheral hospitals and mission hospitals. It's very tricky only, there is no doubt. But as it has been discussed here, we need to stabilize the patient. That means you can be on an NIV for some time, give your adrenaline or whatever the vasoactive agents which is necessary has to be added, and make sure it's stabilized, and then you go for the drugs. Any drugs, even though we say cardio stable, it destabilizes the compensated patient. So that we need to understand and be ready for that. Any questions somebody is asking?
The other thing is etomidate also causes transient adrenal suppression. That is something that we all get kind of concerned about. Especially, our most of our Indian children, they do have all the failure to thrive, and then you're worried about this transient adrenal suppression. The reason they use in a lot of these cardiac units and also in neuro ICUs is because they say it's preferred in head injury. It does not raise your ICP much, and also cardiac, like the belief is it does not have too much of adverse cardiovascular effects. So if you're used to it, it's well and good.
Considered to be a cardio stable.
Considered cardio safe.
Discussed in all surviving sepsis or in every campaign is being come always again and again, especially in a pediatric setup, and then it will go down. So that is thing. But yes, as you said, in highly selective units, they do use it, but not for routine use. Okay. See, likewise, we don't like propofols. I know, but anesthetists, they use left and right for all their, even for kids, right? So we tend to avoid. That's the thing. See, whatever what drug you use, but you need to know, you have to be very familiar with that. You need to be familiar with that and try to anticipate the problems and effectively manage.
It's like know your patient, know your drug also.
Know your patient, know your environment, know your drugs. Anybody there to comment? I could see Joel there. Kala is here?
Hello, sir. This is Jewel. Sorry for not turning my
Hi.
camera on. I'm not dressed for the occasion.
Okay,
Sorry, ma'am. Thank you so
Felicius.
much for the talk. Obviously, I always try to attend because we always can learn something new whenever you tell us tips. So, as someone who's worked long years in mission hospitals, my tip would be if you are a very good incubator, your team may not be that good, the people who are with you. So, from if people who have heard, who are listening today, can make a checklist for your team, that will calm them down and they will know what is expected of them. Maybe ma'am can give them a checklist or something, because I think that would be really very useful for mission hospitals. And Anuj kept saying, Tanuj said kept saying skilled most skilled person, Jolly ma'am. He did not mention that in Australia they actually started an award in ma'am's name. That's the skill level. So please don't try to be like her. You can never reach there. But thank you so much, ma'am, for today. I enjoyed your
Thank you.
session.
Thank you, Jewel, for those kind words. So one of the question I can see in the chat box is, can you use, do you recommend intubation with stylet? So definitely in small neonates, it's general practice is not to use a stylet. It's mainly your worry is whether it will overshoot the tube and you'll cause injury. But you do get these fine stylets which you can put and bend it to just the area where you want to keep the stylet in. For so small newborns, we don't prefer stylet. For bigger children, yes, you can use stylet. Whenever I teach the registrars or fellows for intubation, I do give them the stylet because you might just see only a part of the vocal cords. And if you have a stylet, you can just guide it there. Whereas as you keep doing more laryngoscopy, you'll be able to get the entire cord and have a good view, like a grade 1 view, and then you should be able to intubate without a stylet. So it's more of operator dependent, but generally it is not recommended to use in neonates, but you do use in neonates. The centers I worked in, they do have the neonatal stylets as well, and they will ask you if you want a stylet, and if you say yes, I do want a stylet, when you put the stylet in, sometimes it might just straighten the ET tube and take away the anatomical curvature. So you need to be conscious to just bend at the tip of the tube.
Yeah, but pediatric guidelines are okay with using a stylet,
yeah,
but you need to be careful about injuring the thing. Shajin, those who are working in mission hospital, any challenges you face? Shajin, I can see.
Yes, sir. We do have challenges when we intubate older children, especially adolescents and 11 years, 12 years.
Can you please others mute yourself? Yeah, go ahead, Sergeant, please.
Yeah, so we have had problems when we intubate older children, especially adolescents and children who are more than 10 years. There are many times they go into hypotension, bradycardia. So so I got a feeling that we are not adequately preparing them, like in one case, ma'am was mentioning about giving NIV and improving the oxygenation. So pre-oxygenation and the preparation. So I think that was probably inadequate, which is also causing this sudden deterioration during intubation. And when we give inotropes, because ma'am also mentioned that one way to get them stabilized is to get the inotropes started. So is it okay to start off in peripheral line, or it will work good only when we have a
line is fine.
Absolutely.
Peripheral line is fine.
Yeah, you can just use the routine single strength loading with 0.3 mg per kg in 50 ml. So you can start it off in the peripheral line. You don't have to wait for central line.
So this is, there are guidelines, Sajin. That is, they say 10 times the dilution, but it might be very difficult, but you can use at least 3 to 4 times dilution is in peripheral cannula. Even it is given in your surviving sepsis campaign, you can use inotropes because it's life-saving. No need to wait for central line at all.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And thank you, ma'am.
Okay. One more thing you're talking about is
So somebody has just asked a question on role of Sugamidex. So Sugamidex is usually given as a reversal agent. It's one of the newly available medication to reverse neuromuscular blockade, especially if you've given ROC or VEC. It's quite expensive. It might not be available in all the places. Most of the emergency department trolleys or the crash trolleys are supposed to have a vial of Sugamidex, especially if you have a unable to intubate, unable to oxygenate, difficult to oxygenate patient, then it is safer to try and reverse if you are not having a help at bay immediately. Also, when you're giving Sugamidex, we need to remember that that can also cause tachycardia and hypotension, adding on to our other issues when you're waiting for the help to arrive.
and he was saying, Jolly, just a word about apneic oxygenation you mentioned.
Yes,
Can you
sir.
just tell, because Sajin was talking about that as well, right? When you not only
Yeah.
pre-oxygenate.
So apneic oxygenation, like I said, the other term is basically aventilatory mass flow. So basically when you have these alveoli are filled with oxygen and then they are covered with capillaries which take away the oxygen from them. When it does that, it's leaving the alveoli empty and it causes a negative pressure there. It causes a negative pressure gradient. So when that causes that emptiness, if you give some oxygen in any form, it will automatically draw oxygen from the upper airway into the lungs. So that is the basis or thinking behind apneic oxygenation. So the reason you give that is when you're worried, already they are hypoxemic. If you're going to take a minute to 3 minutes and you don't have enough reserve, you have this apneic oxygenation, which can be connected either by a high flow prongs or even just nasal prongs, and you give oxygen. When you're going in and attempting, there is some oxygen from your upper airway that will keep going down. So that will give you slightly more edge. So all the evidence behind apneic oxygenation, they have shown without giving any extra oxygen, if you go and attempt and whatever reserve you have, if that is gone, and then you desaturate down in 56% of the time, when you give apneic oxygenation, they only desaturate around 14 to 16%. So it has come up actually a big way. And this one of the big studies was from Australia and New Zealand, and I think they did it along with UK. So when I was working there, they had you connect apneic oxygenation on everyone actually, whatever the airway is. But general recommendation, definitely if you're worried about a physiologic difficult airway, it is a good idea to have it. You have an extra little time. You know that with that oxygen is also from the upper airway going to get drawn in into your alveoli.
There is one more question here, ma'am, from Dr. Umesh Saxena. Ma'am, do you recommend the intubation with stylet always?
We did discuss that. So I will not say always. Definitely, I don't prefer using it in neonates, but if I'm getting somebody new to intubate, then I will give them a stylet. Like I told you, it's just that your visualization might not be great. Then you know, okay, even if you see a small portion, they should be able to angulate to put the tube in.
So also remember about can't intubate and can't ventilate. I hope you touched about that, Jolly.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I did.
So if you have a scenario, you before giving a paralyzing agent, you have to be really careful about giving that. Tanuj and Sudho, any final words? And
overall, it's a great training, sir, and Nice words from ma'am.
Thanks for moderating the sessions.
Thank you, Jolly, for the talk.